And a new CBS News Battleground Tracker poll shows a changing picture in the Democratic primary. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren holds a slim lead over former Vice President Joe Biden in early primary and caucus states. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is the only other candidate in polling in double digits with 19% support. Unlike national polls, which include states that won't vote until late spring, the Battleground Tracker focuses on those early states, which will set the tone for later primary contests. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe breaks down the results.
Hello, New Hampshire Democrats!
Senator Elizabeth Warren earned an enthusiastic response at the New Hampshire Democratic Convention, where 19 presidential candidates spoke over the weekend. The new CBS News Battleground Tracker poll shows Warren edging out Joe Biden in the Granite State by 1 point. Biden maintains his lead in Iowa and is blowing away the field in South Carolina, where he has strong support with African Americans. But in Nevada, Senator Bernie Sanders is now in front of Biden and Warren with 29% support.
We got a revolution to make. You ready to do it?
The poll also finds that Warren is picking up the most support from voters changing their minds. For example, 29% of voters who previously supported California Senator Kamala Harris have switched to supporting Warren. It was a rough weekend for Harris, who had to apologize after a man attending one of her town halls called President Trump's actions mentally retarded. And she responded with,
Well said. Well said.
Harris later told CBSN's Caitlin Huey-Burns she didn't hear the man's full comments.
It was not something that I really heard or processed or, or in any way condone. That's for sure.
Meanwhile, former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford announced he is going to challenge President Trump for the Republican nomination.
This is the beginning of a long walk, but it begins with that first step, and that's what I'm announcing here today.
Sanford is now one of 3 Republicans challenging the president for the Republican nomination, but in a sign of how tricky it could be for them, at least 4 states are planning on canceling their GOP primaries, saying it'll save them money given that the president is so popular among Republicans. As for Democrats, they're getting ready for Thursday night's debate in Houston. Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, Washington.
And joining me now, fresh off a trip to the New Hampshire Democratic Convention, is CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, thanks so much for being with us. Boy, really interesting things coming out of this Battleground Tracker poll, right? Let's start with Elizabeth Warren's movement. And now she's leading in one of those early voting states, but by a very, very slim lead. What does this tell you?
Well, it's really interesting. In New Hampshire, this was certainly a hometown crowd for her. Remember, she comes just over the border from Massachusetts. She has made the most stops out of any candidate in New Hampshire. So this is a place where she is positioned to do really well. The enthusiasm for her on the ground has been very striking, and we see that reflected in this poll. We see that her rise, taking away from some other candidates, especially Senator Harris, I think is really significant and coincides with what we are seeing on the ground.
Yeah.
The key is, can she keep up this momentum, and does more scrutiny, is there going to be more scrutiny applied to her from the other candidates?
I want to get to Senator Harris in a moment, but first I want to stick with New Hampshire, a state which Bernie Sanders is now trailing. You asked him about that. Let's play a little bit from your interview with him.
How do you think that Biden is leading in New Hampshire?
I'm not going to really speculate. I mean, obviously, he was vice president for 8 years. Everybody knows him. He's a nice guy. But I think as we get more and more into the campaign and people see the differences between Joe's record and my record, he voted for the war in Iraq, I led the opposition against it, our vision for the future of America, I think we're going to pick up a lot of those votes.
We still don't see the senator going after Elizabeth Warren. He's fine attacking Biden, but not Elizabeth Warren. What does this tell you about how these 3 frontrunners are going to treat themselves in the debate on Thursday?
It's a very telling aspect of this campaign. When you talk to Bernie Sanders and his campaign, they never really go after Elizabeth Warren. When you put the same to Elizabeth Warren's campaign, they don't like to go after Bernie Sanders. And there's a reason for that. They're competing for a lot of the same voters. They're kind of sharing a similar lane throughout this primary. And we see see that also reflected in the polls. So their strategy is they're going to stick together here. It doesn't really make sense right now at this time to go after one another because they're sharing voters. Now, they have very different approaches to how they are campaigning. In New Hampshire, Bernie Sanders is trying to build upon his support in that state and has an organization to do that. But Elizabeth Warren has been really playing into the retail campaign aspect that's so critical in a place like New Hampshire, really trying to meet voters one-on-one. She also invested very early on this campaign on ground game in Iowa, New Hampshire, and some of these early states. We're seeing that now pay off, at least according to the polls and from voters that we're talking to on the ground.
No doubt she's been working hard. She's not been taking any breaks. I want to talk to you about another part of the Battleground Tracker poll that looks at overall the Democratic Party and Democratic voters. I believe 60% think the party's message should be more progressive than the Obama administration, compared to 40% who just want to return to the way things were before President Trump. Now, do you think that could be a cause of concern for Joe Biden, who's sort of campaigning on the latter?
I think this is a really important point in this poll, and I think it's reflected in two candidates, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. Lucky for us, we're going to see them both on this campaign, on the debate stage later this week in Houston. This is the first time they're going to be on the stage together in this kind of way. So this represents two ideas of where the Democratic Party should go. Right now, according to our polling, we see that enthusiasm for Elizabeth Warren and her campaign to make big structural changes. She's very much running on a progressive platform. Her campaign slogan is "Dream big and fight hard." Joe Biden has been reminding voters of his connection to Barack Obama, very much playing into that. Interestingly enough, Andrew Yang, when he was interviewed on CTM last week, said that Joe Biden's campaign is about returning to something in the past. We'll see how that resonates with voters. I will note that it's very interesting in our poll also that increasingly voters who are supporting Elizabeth Warren find her to be more electable, to be able to defeat Donald Trump, which had been a concern for her originally. And she's becoming increasingly voters' second choice, which is important because this is a very fluid race, as we're seeing. So that second choice position really could be effective for her.
It's very viable, for sure. I want to get back to Senator Kamala Harris now. Politico is reporting that members of her campaign accidentally left behind a briefing memo referencing her, quote, summer slump. You spoke to the senator at the New Hampshire Democratic Convention about her lagging poll numbers. Let's take a listen.
You're heading to Houston next week for the debate.
Yes.
Anything that you're doing differently to prepare? The first time you were on that debate stage, your campaign rose in the polling, fell down a little bit. After the second one, plans for the third. Anything different?
You know, I do not rise and fall with the polls. And I think it's really important to know that you got to be steady, you got to work hard. You have to, and I feel it to be my number one commitment to earn the vote of everyone, and I do not expect that it will be given. It has to be earned, and I'm going to work hard to do that.
So, Caitlin, we're still 5 months from the Iowa caucus. Should the Harris campaign be concerned?
Well, when you look at that polling that Elizabeth Warren is taking from Harris supporters, they have a reason to have some concern and to try to, get those numbers up or get the enthusiasm around her campaign up. I also asked her if she is planning on recalibrating her message, if there's any change in strategy for the fall campaign. This comes as the Wall Street Journal has reported that there are some changes that might be made. And she said that she doesn't like to look at the polls, that she is very much trying to focus on investments in New Hampshire and Iowa. But there does seem to be this recognition that she does have to get more support, gain traction. But it's also a telling, her campaign shows us some data points about various strategies. Because remember in that first debate, she went directly after Joe Biden, and that seemed to give her a temporary boost, and then kind of fell back down. So all the other campaigns kind of looking at that strategy, do they take any lessons from it? Do they feel that if you are going after the front runner or another leader in this race, that gets you anything? That remains to be seen, but from Kamala Harris's point of view, that didn't seem to be helping her in the long term.
Right. All right. So another recent development out of these latest polls is that billionaire Tom Steyer will make the October debates. He's an interesting candidate because so many Americans know him as the man who's been trying to impeach President Trump, but not so many know what his platform is necessarily as a presidential candidate. What's your takeaway?
Right, we saw Tom Steyer walking around Manchester over the weekend. I think this is significant because a lot of these other lower tier candidates who didn't make this stage are still trying to make it for October. So as we're starting to see the field narrow a little bit, that October debate also can give some of these candidates hope to advance. Also later this week, I'm going to be watching to see some of those lower tier candidates who did make the debate stage. Someone like a Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Beto O'Rourke, others who haven't really gained much traction over the past month. Can they use this debate to get any momentum or attention for their campaigns?
Right.
We'll see.
All right. Now we do know that the president has a challenger. Republican Mark Sanford has announced that he will run against President Trump for the Republican nomination. Does he pose any real challenge?
Well, this comes as the South Carolina primary for the Republican side isn't really going to happen. The president and the RNC have been shoring up the president's support in these key early states to prevent a challenger from making any headway. This also comes as we continue to see that Donald Trump is polling very well among Republican voters. They like what he is doing. They're enthusiastic about his campaign. So it is very difficult for a challenger to make some strides here, especially since just practically the party is working overtime to make sure that Donald Trump is their nominee.
All right. Well, Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. We really appreciate it.